Okay, well, gives me very great pleasure to welcome Professor Janet Gyatso to Indiana University and the Department of Central Eurasian Studies to deliver the first Gene and Dennis Sinor lecture for the 23-24 academic year. And there will be a second such lecture held in the spring. And like I said, today we are most fortunate to have Janet present here. She's the Hershey Professor of Buddhist Studies at Harvard University. Her research has focused on medicine in Tibet, self-reflection and autobiography in Buddhism, women and gender in Buddhist and Tibetan societies. And one of her current focuses now is human-animal relations, if I understand correctly. She is a world-famous authority on these issues. She has also served as president of the International Association of Tibetan Studies, co-chair of the Buddhist section of the American Academy of Religion, and she is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Today's lecture, I'm sure, is one we'll all find very informative. I am told that in addition to our in-person audience, there are 150 plus individuals registered online, which we're delighted that we got the word out. Thanks to all of you for doing so. And so today, Janet's going to talk to us about doing Tibetology through the lenses of the literary and what that does to Tibetology. Please welcome our speaker. Janet, you can speak for as long as you wish, and then we will have Q&A in person and also curate some of the questions from online. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm sure he's with us in spirit.
What did you say, Elliot?
No, but Elliot would be delighted to get a sign or the who helped endow this.
I see. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me, Professor Chomsky. And I also wanted to thank April Younger for her help in organizing this, and my long departed friends here at Indiana, including Professor Thupten Jigme Ngozi, and well, Chris Beckwith is still here, which I'm so glad to see. But you're just on my list here. And also Elliot Sperling, who was a very, very good friend of mine for a very, very long time. And also want to thank Ginden Russell and Evelyn Washu, who have very nicely hosted me over the last day. And also, I'm so glad to see at least one of my friends from religious studies, Richard Nance. And I've been here before. Elliot hosted the International Association of Tibetan Studies in 1998. And I also was courted along with my husband by the religion department in 2008. We almost moved to Indiana. At the last moment, we went another road, but I almost was here. So anyway, it's really a pleasure to be here. And my talk is slightly long-ish. It will still be under an hour, and also I tend to talk fast, so we'll see how it goes. So, and also I just want to say hi to all the people. I see many of your names up there online, many of my friends. So hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. So whether rightly or wrongly, I understood the honor of being invited to deliver the Gene and Dennis Sinor Faculty Fellowship Lecture as an invitation to discuss the state of the field of Tibetan studies, at least how my own current work connects to trends I see in the field. So today's talk is going to be a thought experiment about academic fields, or rather approaches that we take in our fields, in this case, the field we call Tibetology or Tibetan studies. And I'll be using my own experiences and the work I myself am currently and have been engaged in as examples, hopefully food for thought. So my talk today follows on one that I gave for the ARIS lecture at Oxford's Wilson College in 2015, in which I argued that for Tibetan studies to really flourish, our high bar should be that work in our field should be of interest to scholars outside Tibetan studies. That the way we analyze topics in Tibetan studies, say in Tibetan anthropology or philology or philosophy or history of religious institutions, should be sufficiently capacious that the categories or insights or new terms that we come up with could shed light on the analysis of anthropology or philology or philosophy, et cetera, in other regions of the world as well. Or at least that would be the aspiration. As one simple example, work on the value and role, let's say, of vernacular writings could both draw on and shed light on examples of the turns in vernacular writing in other times and places. And so as I said then, if our work is only interesting to Tibet specialists, it means that it has relevance only for a particular time and place. It cannot participate in larger discussions among intellectuals about life and about society and what it means to be human and what it means to be post-human. And that, I think, would be a failure. So I still agree with that aspiration, both for the field, for my own work. And my talk will pick up on that by focusing on one particular move that I see happening in Tibetology. It's one that I myself have become involved with. To be sure, what I'm about to ponder is not the only recent trend in Tibetan studies worth discussing. And what's more, I also don't necessarily think my larger aspiration need define all work in Tibetan studies. We still have a great deal of first order philology and history and text critical work to do. And let me add that although my own approach leans heavily on critical interpretation in humanities, I also continue to believe that first order philology and history remains essential skills for virtually all work in Tibetan studies. So as my title makes clear, I want to talk about what it means to study literature in Tibetan studies. So for at least 20 years or more, scholars in the field have been paying attention to a development of a new kind of Tibetan writing, modern Tibetan literature, produced mostly since around 1950 and written in genres, styles, and in terms of content that are quite disparate from what we know of Tibetan writing before that. It owes its development in part to a relatively new exposure of Tibetan authors to contemporary writings from China, Europe, and the Americas alike, and which are all increasingly available in Tibetan and or Chinese translation. And of course, that is not to reduce modern Tibetan literature to foreign influence. Its development also has everything to do with the evolving conditions of modern Tibetan life itself. New writings on such topics, which are fiction, novels, autobiography, poetry, are both coming out of communities under the rule of the PRC and in exile. So for the past 3 years, I've been participating in a growing effort among some of my academic colleagues to bring focus to the female writers in this modern literary movement. For Tibetan women, authors have received little attention. So an online writing Tibetan women workshop that I was part of, hosted by University of Virginia 2020, with readings by writers and responses by Tibetological scholars. This was followed by a bunch of smaller Zoom meetings, finally an in-person symposium at UVA in April 2022 that brought 4 women writers, 2 from the PRC, 2 from community in exile in Dharamsala, and a bunch of Tibetological scholars, both ethnic Tibetans and international folks. The 4 women writers then traveled to present their work at Harvard University, Columbia, University of Colorado Boulder. And similarly, the theme meetings have been taking place in European Tibetological scholars, and I myself went to an event with Tibetan women and writers in Paris in 2023, organized by INALCO. This meeting resulted in a resolve to start an online reading group for new writings coming out by Tibetan women. And another conference happened at Northwestern University in 2022, which also raised many of these issues. So the kinds of writings we have been looking at address the lives of women inside Tibet or in exile today. They often have to do with experiences of mothers, wives, daughters, sisters, and their male relatives, their hopes, their sadnesses, their loneliness in their modern predicaments, their disconnect from their still treasured traditional life. And many of these pieces are autobiographical and self-referential. And so how does this material fit into Tibetan studies? What is the point or benefit of turning our attention to it? More broadly, what skills do we need to bring to the study of the imaginative and artful writings of fiction and poetry? On what terms can and should literary criticism be part of what we consider as the field of Tibetan studies? On what terms can and should scholars and literary critics evaluate these novels and poems in terms of their literary merits? What is the role of things like empathy and imagination and personal resonance on the part of the academic literary scholar? So if we think about the history of Tibetan studies, we can realize how far something like the study of modern Tibetan literature, let alone modern Tibetan literature written by women, might take us. In my experience as a university student in the 1970s, Tibetology in the United States, at least, was primarily of interest for what it offers to scholars seeking to recover and or date Buddhist scriptures that have been lost in Sanskrit, but are well preserved with their exceptionally literal translations in Tibetan. As but one example, although I myself was focused on Tibetan Buddhism, I was in a Buddhist studies program at UC Berkeley, which regarded Sanskrit and Pali texts as the gold standard for a still widespread effort to reconstruct the history of original Buddhism. Tibetology was indeed viewed differently here at Indiana, actually, and especially in Europe, particularly France, and also Hungary, Russia, Italy, Germany, UK, through the mid to late 20th century, where Tibetan history on its own terms, or in terms of the history of regional studies in Asia, was of interest quite apart from its connection to Buddhist studies, especially following the uprising against Chinese rule in 1959 and the escape of many Tibetans to South Asia and beyond. We had the fortune, that is for us academics in Tibetan studies, of a new availability of many highly specialized, many highly educated native Tibetan scholars, both clerics and lay people. Tibet's fascinating but often recondite history, including, of course, its creative and massive contribution to Buddhism, was finally something that could be studied competently and the full riches of the Tibetan language appreciated, and not limited to the kind of Tibetan language that was devised especially to translate Sanskrit and Prakrit. So having gotten into Tibetan studies through meeting Tibetan people, I myself was frustrated with the approach in the field that focused on the recovery of Sanskrit texts. My own excitement on entering Tibetan studies was to explore the specifically Tibetan contribution to Buddhism, to religion, and to many other aspects of human life. But at about the time that I was finishing my dissertation at Berkeley, which was on someone named Tangtong Gyalpo, King of the Empty Plain, who's a remarkable, long-lived 14th, 15th century so-called treasure discoverer and Buddhist master, who also built iron chain suspension bridges throughout the Tibetan plateau. I learned about the first meeting of the International Association of Tibetan Study, or IATS, which was set to happen in Oxford in 1979. My entree into that scholarly community vastly supported and encouraged me. This is not to say, however, that I didn't have some frustration with European Tibetology as well. Tangtong Gyalpo was in part famous for his so-called treasure discoveries, or terma, a special visionary literary genre. But terma had been declared largely useless by such Tibetological luminaries as Giuseppe Tucci and Andrei Vostrikov for its highly mythologized version of the history of early Tibetan religion, as well as its highly dubious authorship attributions. So my response was to say that terma material, and there's a massive amount of it, starting from at least 11th century, was massively interesting and important for the field, for its astonishing literary imagination, for its invention of new kinds of religious ritual, for its invention of many new literary genres, for its fascinating visionary voice, for the intriguing role of the female gender in it, many other virtues. And we certainly should be able to bracket questions of positivist historical accuracy and still have so much to ponder in this material of value. So this response of mine tells me in retrospect that at the time, under the influence of the intellectual tenor of the program at Berkeley, my own interests were largely still historicists. I was asking what terma can tell us about literary genres and voices and ritual, etc. I was doing what might be called cultural history. But as I have matured in my own career and hopefully in my life, instead of using material like terma for what we can learn about Tibetan culture, I have more and more begun to take opportunities to study terma and other topics in terms of what I can learn from the material. And here I'm invoking an important distinction made popular by my own husband, Charles Hallisey. It's basically the distinction between learning about versus learning from. Moving my focus of interest beyond questions of dates and names and place names and historical events, my writing in this area started to be fueled instead by a personal intrigue I had with the very idea of revelatory dreams or visions and the practice of visionary inspired writing and the semiology of how people read signs in their lives to create meaning for themselves and decide what to do. And so in other words, I found myself less and less trying to position myself over here at a distance, evaluating and representing what treasured tradition is as an object, and more into what I can learn from Tibetan writings and history on such topics. And this is also the direction in which literary studies also inexorably leads us. To read literature as literature, to be in some sense, is to be in some sense personally engaged by it. To read literature as art for its own merits, in the way that it uses words, rather than what the words tell us about something, pretty much requires that the scholar break out of the position of objective observer and rather be receptive to a piece of writing's beauty or effectiveness or impact. In other words, by literature or the literary, I don't mean everything written in Tibetan. When I talk about Tibetan literature, I mean it in the sense of the English word when it refers to writings that are particularly imaginative and expertly conveyed in terms of their style, their structure, and their impact on the reader. Something like what is referred to as belles lettres. And more specifically, as I recently wrote in an article on the literary merits of the life story of Milarepa, I consider the category of literature to apply to a text that takes advantage of its own mechanisms, the very possibilities that the medium of writing itself offers or affords to both convey and evoke feelings and experiences and kinds of knowledge beyond the purely documentary or descriptive. So this definition that I offered in that recent piece was framed in terms of how the text is composed. But for the purposes of this present talk, I would stress rather the implications of that definition in terms of how to read Tibetan literature. The implication is that despite historical, geographical, and cultural distance, to read literature as literature is to be positioned as part of a receptive human audience of the text. One is using one's own personal resources and experiences to understand what the text is doing. And to do that would be to move the work of Tibetan studies in a significantly new direction. So part two. So we're back to how the study of the literary might impact what we think of as Tibetan studies. First of all, let me be clear. I'm not really doing modern Tibetan literary studies. I'm just dancing around the edges of that subfield. I went to some conferences, I asked a few ignorant questions, and I met some great people and wrote just a few pages. But I am indeed working on pre-modern Tibetan literature and have been doing so for some time. In what follows then, what I'm really doing is following a thread from the question of the place of modern literature in Tibetan studies to the study of everything we can call literature in Tibetan history, and as well as even the larger question of the way we might do Tibetan studies altogether. As I will develop, it's obvious that pretty much any example of belles lettres written in modern times will have some purchase on pretty much any modern reader, given the commonality of our global modern condition. That observation may in turn help us grapple with what does it mean to have purchase on the reader altogether? And that's what I'm really trying to get at in this. So I myself started doing pre-modern Tibetan literary studies with my book on the autobiographies of Jigme Lingpa. Jigme Lingpa was a major treasure discoverer, but in the book project, I quickly became even more interested in the literary dimensions of his writings, rather than necessarily the treasure tradition itself, although I still love that too. But in particular, I was captured by the beauty of the spectacular two so-called secret autobiographies that he wrote. As soon as the first time I heard a rendition of parts of it from an old friend, Stephen Goodman, in the early 1990s, I believe, I was exceptionally captivated by it and I wanted to study it right away. And then I had a further epiphany when I realized early on in that project that the genre of autobiography had a very key place within international literary theory, as well as cultural history more broadly. And so I said, oh, maybe I should look at that sometime. But when I started to read it, I was amazed how relevant and enlightening it was for Tibetan autobiography. Not that it mentioned Tibetan autobiography at all. It didn't, not at all. In fact, it suggested that true autobiography is limited to the modern West and was not to be found elsewhere in the world, which would include Tibet. But it was that failure that became really meaningful to me. Despite the ignorance of Western literary theory on the existence of Tibetan autobiography, the many things it actually says about the genre of autobiography, what it means for an author to write down their own life story, was really useful for figuring out a lot of things going on in Tibetan autobiography. I remember in particular reading literary critic Paul Doman about the so-called specularity of the Hall of Mirrors in Nietzsche's autobiography, Ecce Homo. Really, it sounded exactly like, I swear, I was amazed. It sounded exactly like Doman was talking exactly about Jigme Lingpa's autobiography, who uses the metaphor of the mirrors of the self all the time. I said, oh my God, he's talking about Jigme Lingpa. How could that be? Anyway, this all meant, and it still means, that Tibetan autobiography might in some ways sometimes be appreciated and understood in terms not distinctive to Tibet or Tibetan history or even Asia at all. And what that in turn means is that Tibetan autobiography was and is subject to questions that are also relevant to me, a modern person brought up exclusively in the West, where indeed autobiography and self-writing have really taken off in the world of publishing. In fact, I realized the whole reason I was attracted to working on the Jigme Lingpa autobiographies in the first place was that they somehow spoke to me, a modern American Ashkenazi Jewish reader, kind of directly. My favorite line in Jigme Lingpa's autobiography, when the hero says to a female disciple, shoot your arrows in every direction. Where they hit, that's where you have karmic connections. So I'm not going to unpack what that meant to me, or even the original readers of Jigme Lingpa's text. You can think about it for yourself. So there are many questions we can raise about the academic study of modern Tibetan literature. First of all, going back to modern Tibetan literature, what even counts as modern Tibetan literature? The way it is depicted these days includes not only literary work in Tibetan language, but also Sinophone, Anglophone, Francophone, and writings by Tibetans in other languages as well. So that would mean that it is defined not by its language, but by the ethnic identity of its author. And yet that distinction might have difficulty standing too. What if I, in this Jewish Ashkenazi body, happen to have been born and raised in Tibet and also wrote in Tibetan? Would my poetry be part of what we consider modern Tibetan literature? On the other hand, what if an ethnically Tibetan person is born and raised, say, entirely in the US, knows little to nothing about Tibetan language or culture and history, and just writes poetry about their current life, say, as a marine biologist in Woods Hole, Massachusetts? Is that modern Tibetan literature? Would it be studied by a Tibetologist? Also, as I've already suggested, to consider modern Tibetan literature is to consider literature that is a product of our very globalized modern world, and therefore subject to issues, trends, ideas, experience that far transcend the specifically Tibetan cultural arena. And so even in terms of content, what exactly constitutes its Tibetanness is up for discussion. And we might well disagree. But I myself have long moved away from what I admit during my younger years was a romantic commitment to preserving Tibetan culture against modernity, to preserve a society that could sustain its venerable traditions in peace. Now I know all too well that not only is that impossible, but it's not even desirable. Tibetans need to be as modern as everyone else. Yes, it means a dilution and change in their traditional ways, but it is a matter of life and death to be able to function in our contemporary society in every political, economic, and technological way possible. So let's back up again. And this time I'm going to provide a tentative and loose definition of modern Tibetan literature. Let's say it is that self-consciously artistic, creative writing which is produced by cultural Tibetans today, with a few oddball exceptions like the writings of my fantasized alter ego, who would have liked to have been born and raised in Tibet, and which at least in some important ways is situated in a cultural worldview that is informed by Tibetan culture today, specifically either inside Tibet or in the Tibetan exile communities. In both cases, cultures that still have pretty firm roots in their own pre-modern society. And it certainly makes sense that this material would be the purview of Tibetan studies. But now I would add that what makes it particularly appropriate is that the practitioners of Tibetan studies. So Tibetologists are already relatively competent readers of this literature, precisely because, as I already noted, this modern literature addresses a combination of things we are familiar with, namely modern life, with some ingrediency of specifically Tibetan culture within that. Nonetheless, to make this point does indeed expand the purview of Tibetan studies to material that we research scholars have personal access to and investment in. Crucially, it means now we're treating modern Tibetan literature not as a foreign product of another time and place, but something in which we in the present world and all of us have at least some traction and buy-in. So let me repeat that. Crucially, it means we are now treating modern Tibetan literature not as a foreign product of another time and place, but something in which we, all of us, have at least some traction and buy-in. We can feel personally addressed and impacted by the literature. We are part of its readership, its audience, deliberately intended or not. And that's a good thing. I think not only for Tibetologists, but for modern Tibetan literature itself. It means that modern Tibetan literature is a player in modern literature, period. It has a voice that speaks, at least to some extent, to larger human issues, one that is relevant to life on planet Earth rather than only and exclusively inside Tibet and its exiled communities. That means, for example, that a Tibetologist might subject modern Tibet literature to gender analysis or feminist critique, to finally get back to where I started with women's Tibet literature. But feminist critique has been a controversial approach with regard to the past. What is the status and appropriateness of feminist critique on a literature from a culture different from that of the critic, as some would still insist? Would it truly be criticism or rather a historical point that ideas and doctrines of type X led historically to women's subordination socially or something like that? But yet, as I have tried to point out, the critic who receives Tibetan literature as speaking to them today would indeed be invested in its message and its social implications, precisely to the degree that Tibetan literature is a player in global consciousness right now. And so they have a right to weigh in. And yet, just because we can now conceive of Tibetan modern literature as addressing an audience beyond modern Tibetans, that doesn't mean that concerns around cultural sensitivity, not to mention cultural competency, are unwarranted. Feminist criticism, let alone literary criticism writ large, requires, first of all, yes, historical contextual knowledge, as well as cognizance of context, as well as a certain diffidence, a certain respect and empathy, and especially if one is wading into a context which one is not a fully fledged member. And so now the implications of that means that I have to ratchet back the claim I just made a few paragraphs ago, namely that to view Tibetan literature as fully addressing me and in whose readership I have purchased means that it is open to modern feminist criticism. That claim is actually only partially true. Not everyone and anyone is qualified to be a literary critic, and many skills and competencies are needed. And so this is where the really hard part comes in. This is where we enter a graduate program and we graduate from kindergarten, in which hard and fast and yes and no and right and wrong positions could be claimed. What I'm trying to land in is a kind of hybrid point of view, a mixture between cultural specificity and human universal practices and values, an imperfect mixing of subjectivities, and the need for expert translation. And so this is where I want to start talking about the ongoing and crucial role of the indigenous expert scholars in all of Tibetan studies. This is part 3, last part, but it's still long. But this is the best part. I want to recenter the place of the indigenous scholar in Tibetan studies. I have long been thinking about this imperative, given how closely I myself have worked with indigenous Tibetan scholars throughout my entire education and subsequent career. I was recently strongly reminded of its urgency when I participated a year ago in an effort to draft a statement of professional ethical principles for the IATS organization. The committee consisted of 3 Tibetan scholars and myself. And as we worked through what we wanted to say on professional ethics, the issue of Tibetan participation in international Tibetological research as expert informants, research assistants, translators came up repeatedly. We ended up drafting several distinct principles regarding proper authorship credits for Tibetan collaborators, explicit and full acknowledgements, ongoing and careful attention to the political vulnerabilities of Tibetans involved in foreign research projects, possible abuse of power on the part of foreign researchers, and imperative for those of us who are well-positioned and who best know how to navigate the system to elevate Tibetan colleagues in their own efforts to participate and gain recognition in the international world of Tibetan studies. Unfortunately, this document did not get the approval of the General Assembly a year and a half ago in Prague, and we are currently revising the document, hopefully for a passage at the next meeting of IAS in 2026. Well, my own concern today is not really about equity and the elevation of indigenous Tibetan scholars, although I firmly believe in that. What I'm really getting at, however, is the epistemic value of their participation in our field. In fact, indigenous Tibetan scholars have had an outsized role in the development of modern international Tibetan studies. Without their role in teaching foreign scholars to read Tibetan, especially the types of Tibetan that are not translation of Sanskrit, and which due to idiosyncratic cadences and innuendos and arcane vocabulary and lack of a determinative morphology and so on, they can't be understood simply by using a dictionary. Without the help of indigenous Tibetan scholars, the world would have had little access to the large proportion of Tibetan writings, not to mention colloquial language. Nor would scholars have any idea where to find its historiography, its ritual literature, its belles lettres, or how to navigate its complex doxographical and polemical literature. Surely this is also true for every language and literary culture that foreign scholars have tried to plumb, but perhaps Tibetan has remained even more arcane than many others due to the short history of its exposure outside of its borders and lack of critical apparatus. But we need only think of the intricate ingrediency of erudite Tibetan informants in the groundbreaking work of George Auric, who worked with Gindan Trimpel, Giuseppe Tucci, who worked with Namkha Norbu, Turl Wiley, who worked with Dechen Rinpoche, R.A. Stein, who was helped by someone named Paul Sharap, and later Dapo Rinpoche and Samden Karme, David Snowgrove, who worked deeply dependent on Sangye Tenzin, Samden Karme, et cetera, properly acknowledged or not. I do believe the field did enter a kind of another stage by the 1980s or so, when many second or third generation Tibetologists acquired the literacy to tackle Tibetan writing on their own. And yes, also with the help of our very expanded critical apparatus, which is now available on the internet. But I'm suggesting that with the turn in the field to, with the turn in the field to more vernacular and standard kinds of writing, and especially the growing interest in Tibetan literature as literature, that the valuable contributions of our native Tibetan colleagues needs recentering. So I use the term indigenous scholar advisedly, because I think that more than mere knowledge of facts and language, being from the culture, knowing the ins and outs of linguistic etiquette, knowing the ins and outs of idiosyncratic usage and dialects, that such things are critical competencies that are sine qua non for fully appreciating the riches of literature. Indigenous scholars are, as in scholars who are from the land, who know the logic of the land and the logic of native imagination, who can read Tibetan out loud with the proper intonation, emphasis, and timing, who, yes, may be more personally invested in the reception of the literature of a certain lineage or another and its fortunes than the so-called objective scholar, but for that very reason has a deep understanding of what's at stake. Who at the highest level of readership can beef up the capacity of empathy in the foreign scholar, can illustrate and can model what it looks like. Importantly, I don't think that close collaboration with native scholars should be regarded as a failure on the part of the research or the up-and-coming tenure candidate, but rather as a plus. I think that collaborative reading, especially across disparate cultural backgrounds and training, is better than the readings and translations of an individual operating on their own. And it's absolutely crucial, I believe, for being able to appreciate Tibetan literature, and most of all, that hybrid product that is modern Tibetan literature. I'm thinking of the famed 20th century Tibetan polymath Gindan Trimpel, who was a stalwart proponent of vernacular Tibetan, as distinct from the kind of Tibetan design for Sanskrit translation. He was a proponent of the innuendos and the richness of direct and candid ways of speaking in Tibetan societies and its superior potential for writing poetry. He insisted that poetry needs to be written in one's native tongue, and also that it cannot be fully appreciated by non-native speakers. This is his view. He himself claimed that he could not experience what he called the true taste of English poetry, even though he could understand its words. And that notion of taste here is one dimension of the indigenous. No, none of this is to force an absolutely dualist distinction between the native reader and the foreign one, nor to say that it's impossible to appreciate the flavor of literature if you're not a native speaker. As I already tried to suggest, training, talent, empathy, experience are identity free, not to mention that it's always relative as to who actually counts as native anyway, and who does not, and who is somewhere in between. I continue to bemoan what I remember from some years ago when an Indian scholar was denied an academic job in Shakespeare studies in the UK out of concern that apparently someone from such a foreign culture could not really understand the great English master. Such a view is wrong in any case, but in the particular case of India, when we remember the years of British colonial rule and the long, very robust and productive place of Shakespeare in Indian universities down to the present, is preposterous, orientalizing, and dangerous. And so what I'm really trying to get at is this hybrid calculus, but one that nonetheless takes cognizance of the preponderance of weight in the corner of the native scholar. So I'm really trying to burn my bridges at two ends at one time. Just looking. How are we doing for time?
We're fine.
Am I?
Yeah.
Oh, I am actually. We just started at 4:30. Okay, we're getting to the good part. Wait for the good part. Okay, I'm very much informed in these comments by my own scholarly experiences, which, as I already indicated, has veered towards subjective study and the study of Tibetan literature. Several years ago, I ventured, this is the good part. Several years ago, I ventured, inadvertently became involved in the study of pre-modern Tibetan belles lettres. It was the sort that Gindan Chömpel, as I just mentioned, he derided, which was namely kavya, or nyengak, the style of poetry, which is deeply indebted to Sanskrit poetic theory. Even though, by the way, Gindan Chömpel also was burning his bridges at both ends because he criticized it, but he was also a master of writing great kavya poetry. Anyway, that's Gindan Chömpel. So I was invited to participate in a working group on the influence of Dundin in Asia at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, in hopes that I could provide insight on Dundin's reception in Tibet, which was enormous. But I knew little about kavya theory, and I've long been of the type that doesn't like kavya all that much, in strong favor of what I consider to be more Tibetan literature. But I got the brilliant idea to invite Pema Bum, an old friend, and many of you will know is a leading figure in the study of Tibetan literature, and not to mention an acclaimed author of novels and essays in his own right, and well known to the old timers in our audience here today for teaching here at Indiana from 1994 to 1997. I invited him to join me in this role. And our collaboration far exceeded my simple expectation that having Pema on board would rescue me from carrying a task for which I was ill-prepared. The passages that he brought to the table for us to consider were rich and lively, including a long and virulent Tibetan resistance to kavya despite its success there. But even more so, the kavya proper that Pema chose for us to read actually dripped with Tibetan flavor and innuendo. This was partially because of Pema Bum's own judicious choices, but all the more so by his astute readings. He showed the workshop, he showed me and the workshop and eventually the world in the essays we published together on the topic, how Tibetans leveraged Indian kavya tropes for their own quite local purposes. One particular example concerns the image that graces the poster for this talk. So now we can put that up for a moment. So this image is our effort to illustrate something that is mentioned in a stanza If you, maybe, can you make that sort of bigger-ish?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Where am I? So this image is mentioned in a stanza which was penned in true Kavya Alankara style by one Perkeba Mipamgyalek, 17th century. He was a learned colleague, but apparently rival of the fifth Dalai Lama. In the stanza, Perkeba deploys the Indian literary figure of Samasopti, which is condensed illusion, whereby one can refer to one thing by talking about another thing that has similar attributes. Actually, he's illustrating a subtype of that figure whereby some of the qualities mentioned are shared by both things and some only refer to one or the other. And this figure was confusing to Tibetan commentators, but Perkeba utilized it to score a very local Tibetan agenda. So you can see the verse. With the taut shape of an 8-footed lion Garuda, he is forever posed haughtily in the monastery looking super awesome. He performs his duties, but he's actually inanimate. It's a child's mind that would find this wondrous. Now, the whole point of the figure of condensed illusion is that it is a way to say something about someone or something without actually naming them directly. Pema Blum told me that the verse has long been understood by Tibetan readers as a jab at the fifth Dalai Lama himself, even though he's not mentioned. Through the use of the convention of this figure, the poet, in one and the same stroke, can attribute even worse features to the intended referent than are actually true. So the Dalai Lama is not exactly inanimate, but he can get away with suggesting it anyway and with impunity. Thus can Perkeba mock the Dalai Lama's power as a mere posture, like a statue or painting, a posture that can be readily assumed, but that does not actually require animation, intelligence, or creativity. It is as if one can be the Dalai Lama merely as a figurehead, a status that need not only imply that need not imply talent of any kind. And as Pema got me to notice, not only does Perkeba deploy this mythical figure of the Garuda lion as a metaphor for the Dalai Lama, Perkeba also implies that the actual Dalai Lama really regards himself as some kind of awesome Garuda lion. So how embarrassing and ironic. In the end, as the verse shows, the Dalai Lama is making an awful mistake. Being a mythic Garuda lion is to be an inert and imprisoned statue. Thus, the very use of this Indian literary figure can be seen as a comment on the fact that since trope and intended referent don't actually match, on the one hand, the Dalai Lama is not really inert. On the other hand, even if the Dalai were to become a Garuda lion, it would not bring him the power and respect he craves. The whole situation is terribly sad. The Dalai Lama may brandish his position, but that does not guarantee true prestige as a world scholar or sage. Only a child would be tricked. So, of course, I never would have realized any of this had it not been for what Pema showed me in that verse. After explaining the figure of after explaining what condensed illusion is in the first place, and he was informed by oral Tibetan reception of this verse and a lot of local glee at the spat between these two learned figures, the Dalai Lama and Perkeba, that Tibetans would relish with a sort of schadenfreude. Pema showed me how the verse is daring and funny. It makes the Dalai Lama look ridiculous, and so does this image that the verse describes. Actually, the image, if you'll notice, doesn't exactly have 8 feet, but we weren't actually able to find an image that had 8 feet, but it is a mixture of a Garuda and a lion. It's a really weird image. But so it's not exactly connected to that, but you can see. So that's the Dalai Lama. I didn't say that. Anyway, it serves quite well to illustrate the preposterous posing of the institution of the Dalai Lama. I never would have seen it. I probably would have I myself would have thought, oh, this is one of those mythological figures that Tibetans believe in. Never would I have seen it that it is sarcastic. That not the image itself, but the way that he uses it in the verse. So that's the kind of perception that I'm really valuing in collaboration with native scholars like Pema, not to mention being privy to that long and oral tradition. Pema is also far more receptive than I am to the particular flavor of irony. What is ridiculous to a Tibetan audience, how certain pretensions are marked and devalued, and even that there is a robust distance between the supposed utter devotion that all Tibetans have for the Dalai Lama and the reality that there actually is still room for mockery and sarcasm. Maybe some of us scholars, we kind of know that historically, but it's much harder to detect in subtle, deliberately arcane poetic allusion. It's much harder to see it in literature. Now, I'm pleased to announce, that Pem and I have recently embarked on another project, one for which I'm really grateful to him for suggesting, seemingly out of thin air. I don't know why he would have chose to do it with me, but I'm grateful and honored. So we've started reading passages from a collection called the Kadam Puche, which was redacted probably in 13th or 14th century, but with much earlier roots. This interesting collection is known to the scholarly community for its teachings of the Indian teacher Atisha that it preserves, along with a set of Jataka-like previous life stories of the Indian master, of Dromdumba. But Pema has noticed that it also contains lengthy and very curious and detailed accounts of conversations and negotiations going on in the audience of Atisha between various disciples of the master. These passages are written in often archaic and local vernacular language and are rife with literary devices and extremely engaging narrative strategies. Pema says they read like a novel. They are definitely the sort of Tibetan that was spoken on the ground during the period of their composition, and in Pema's mind, they read like literature. And I heartily agree. So as I said, it's a privilege for me to read this interesting material with Pema. He himself does not always understand what's going on himself, and extremely generously, he sometimes entertains my own ignorant ideas of what the lines are saying, and once in a very great while, he accepts them as plausible. But my real point is to highlight that literary space, that literary point of view, POV, which into which reading this material with Pema brings me. We are not reading it for historical data. We're reading for the pleasures of the text, and the wit and the irony are tangible. I would never have picked up the subterfuge, for example, when a certain prominent patron from Atisha's assembly traveled to the locale of an aberrant disciple and started making inquiries, were it not for Pema. I never realized that the questions represented not some rather flat dialogue, which is how I would have read it, but were deliberately crafted so as to make the questioner appear ignorant and innocent, so that he could find out what he wanted. Pema is so much better than me at stepping back and getting the general gestalt of what is going down, even if we don't understand every single word. So even if we're reading about events that purportedly happened 1,000 years ago in an area of the Tibetan plateau far from Pema's own home, he is still so far better equipped to size up plausible moves in the social milieu. He is still so far more astute than I am about semantic implication and innuendo. It is certainly not impossible for a foreign reader to detect such innuendo or wordplay, far from it. And as I already indicated, I myself did try to do my own literary reading of the Miller life story. And I would probably say that part of my own ability to imaginatively immerse myself in the position of an intended reader came from my own many years of immersion in Tibetan-speaking communities, where, although I never became very good, I did get a lot of the sense of humor rub off on me. But it's just that Pema is approximately 15 million times better at reading the movie of a Tibetan story and the disposition of its characters. That's all. Now, just a few more short examples. I also experienced similar benefits, insights during a recent joint project I want to mention that I did with Lama Gyep, who's another great Tibetan literary critic, on the reception of the Meghadutta story in Tibet. And long ago, when it was first dawning on me that I needed to pay attention to the literary dimensions of autobiography of Jigme Lingpa, I had another dose of blessed insight from another expert indigenous reader, the late Nyingma scholar Kempo Belden Sherop, who kindly went over every word of that entire text with me. And I'll never forget the moment when I was trying to pin down the precise grammar in a certain arcane line. I was preparing a translation of this work, and I wanted to get it as precise as possible. when what the line was asserting was that one should space out into the radiant primordial expanse of intelligence. Meanwhile, I was insisting we nail down whether the term for space out was a verb or a noun, a distinction which, by the way, is frequently unclear in classical Tibetan. I remember looking up and being taken by surprise as Khenpo and his equally learned brother Khenpo Tsewang erupted into giggles, and it taken me a few seconds to realize they were laughing at the ludicrous discrepancy between what the line was saying and what I was doing, which was about as far as you can get from spacing out into the radiant expanse of intelligence as you can get. And that's when I started to realize the difference between reading a text for its information on Tibetan culture or religious belief and reading it as a reader who was subject to the text, indeed one of its addressees. So if the logic of my talk is at all legible, you have realized by now a certain disconnect that I relied on at the start on the overlap of worlds between modern Tibetan literature and modern Western academics in order to argue that the latter were part of the audience of the former. But now I've been giving examples of readership and address from pre-modern texts where there arguably is less overlap of worlds, and we need to rely on our Tibetan learned colleagues. So again, as I said, I'm really trying to get at that hybrid space. What I'm really after is a frame of mind, a way of approaching what we study that is available to what the text can do to us to receive the liberties it is taking with the written word and the affordances that it provides. I am indeed saying that native readers are far more prepared to read in this way, but that other Tibetologists can learn from and participate in such educated receptivity. So let me just offer one more example of reading of a text from the past with another native reader, this time my erudite and very sadly departed doctoral student Yanga from Lhasa Medical College, who was my graduate student in the Inner Asian Altec Studies Department at Harvard in the early 2000s, who also actually served as my teacher because he was my student, but he also helped me get through some difficult passages when I was working on Tibetan medicine. What impressed me over and over again, quite beyond and apart from what he endeavored to instruct me about technical terminology and the cosmology of traditional Tibetan medicine, was how he reacted to the passages that I brought to him. I can still hear that low, sardonic chuckle when we read a few paragraphs in the history of medicine by the 17th century regent Desi Janet Gyatso, where the latter, in the course of telling the life stories of predecessors in the field of medicine, all of a sudden he starts critiquing his predecessors in quite sarcastic and frankly aggressive terms. I was taken aback at that breach of literary etiquette for the genre of life storytelling, which is always highly complimentary. But it was Yanga's chuckle, it was the texture of his chuckle more than anything that shifted my way of reading the passage. He was laughing at what I can only call the chutzpah of the Desi. How candidly he was displaying his competitive ambition and how sure he was of himself. Would I have been able to see that on my own? Maybe. Certainly, I would need the whole picture of the Desi's career to process his literary liberties, along with the whole picture of Tibetan high society during the Desi's day, which also, by the way, included Pokeva, who we talked about before, and who the Desi also knew, and by the way, he made fun of him as well. But the old school hands-off objective scholarly stance of Tibetology won't do the trick for that. And it is our Tibetan colleagues who can help lead the way as we get a much better appreciation of what Tibet was and still is through our growing capacity to appreciate their artful ways of writing, which extends, in fact, far beyond poetry and those genres that we would conventionally even label as literature. And especially if we listen to things like chuckles and sighs and all the other dimensions of human life that literature ropes into words, but of course are so much more than that. So one final example from my own work, or to be precise, a project I have started, which actually has been interrupted, can illustrate what I see as some of the openings and possibilities as our Tibetan colleagues take their place within the rest of the academic field of Tibetology. So this loops back to the opening of my talk. So after the conference at Virginia and the trip around the US of those 4 Tibetan women writers in 2022, Two of the women who were supposed to return to China found their flight had been canceled, and they had a long delay in the United States. And I thought, oh, this would be a great chance to have some more time to talk with one of them, especially the very impressive Chime, also known as Pemato, who's from Rebgol. She's an amazing poet, extremely well-versed in pre-modern literature, as well as modern novels and fiction, not only from China, but from Europe and the US as well. I was wondering how her knowledge of pre-modern Tibetan literature influenced her own contemporary writing, and tried to ask her about it. I found that she's a firm believer in the need and the fact of modern Tibetan writing's entrance into new styles and genres far beyond those of her heritage. And yet that heritage also impacts her greatly. So I asked her who she liked. In particular, we decided to look at the work of one of her favorites, Dorupchen Jigme Denpa Nyima, who's another great Tibetan Lama intellectual from the 19th century. Our conversation was facilitated by Tashi Dickey, who's currently a graduate student in anthropology at UVA. And soon Tashi was one of the interlocutors in what had become a three-way conversation. We ended up hitting on one piece that Dorupchen wrote, in which he uses the first person to express the feelings of a yak who's been misused and unappreciated by his human owners, and who chastens them for their lack of compassion. The yak is yelling at the humans for, you're supposed to be compassionate. This touched something close to all three of our hearts. I myself would call it a love of animals, not to mention the marvel of how a human can access the subjectivity of an animal, and in poetic verse, no less. So we plan to translate that piece and then to write our own reactions to it, how we read it, how it works on us, how it affects us. I have a feeling that there's going to be a lot of overlap and meeting of the minds and hearts in what we each of us write, despite our disparate background and ages. Our hope is that our three reactions will play off each other, learning from each other, nudging each other forward in what reading is like, what caring for our animal kin is like, and what it's like to join hearts and minds with a man from a previous century who wrote some special poetic lines. This is the kind of relationality and relating that I would hope the demands placed on us by the study of literature serve to usher us into more broadly in the field we're calling Tibetan studies or Tibetology. So thank you.
So let me open the floor to questions here in the room, and also Ben, you will maybe moderate and pick some questions from online.
Yeah, let me just say, if you have a question online, please either put it in the chat and I'll read it out, or use the raise hand function and we can call on you as appropriate.
So please, questions and not comments.
This is not a comment. It may sound actually like I'm just fishing for gossip, and I don't mean this to sound this way, but you mentioned that the document that you drafted regarding ethical principles for indigenous scholarship for the IATS was rejected at Prague. And I know no one likes to know how the sausage is made, and I don't want you to divulge anything that's actually confidential, but I was wondering if you could share any reflections you have on why that document was rejected and what that might suggest about the state of the field today.
This is a very hot and still raw topic. No, I'm not one to shy away from a hot and raw topic. It was a public meeting, but I won't name names, but some of my best friends. I think it's a complex set of answers. One part of it had to do with that we were talking about sexual abuse, and I think, I'm sorry to say it, but I think especially a number of our colleagues who are in the other gender that I'm mostly not were a little bit threatened by it. They're not used to it in this field. You know, Tibetan studies is, so many professional organizations have those standards already. We're way behind. But I do think it wasn't only that. It was, I think, the way that we were calling for accountability and acknowledging the role of our interlocutors kind of rubbed a still somewhat orientalized field the wrong way. I'm sorry to say this, people, but it was a very divisive meeting, I would say. And I can tell you more in private.
Thank you.
But we're hoping to heal the wound. We're maybe the thing we drafted was a little bit too long and too detailed, and so we're hoping to simplify it, and hopefully we'll have a meeting of the minds next time.
Other questions?
Let's take Louis online.
Louis, if you can unmute and show yourself, please.
Yes, hello. I was wondering if you could give some more explanation on the Garuda lion and why that is like a, I guess, controversial way to depict the Dalai Lama.
So I think, you know, it's a quote unquote mythological animal. Already the Garuda is a kind of, you know, it's not necessarily something that we've seen in reality. It's a part of certain kinds of stories. So it represents a kind of elevated, kind of exotic animal per se. And I think that the poet Purkeva was using that particular figure, and especially, it's not even a Garuda, it's half Garuda, half lion. So it's even doubly or triply kind of weird and exotic. To really talk about the, in some sense, preposterous, you know, idea that the Dalai Lama, the figure, this Tibetan person sitting on the throne, is in fact the you know, human emanation of the Bodhisattva of Avalokiteshvara. He's taking it much further. I mean, you know, this is obviously a theological, very sophisticated idea of what it means for a human to be partially divine and partially human. And he's totally aware of that. But he, in this particular mood that he's in, he's just playing on its ridiculousness to say, this is what you are, this is what you really are. You think you're so great. You know, the Dalai Lama comes out in the potol and he's got this really fabulous, you know, kind of hat and robes and, you know, music. And, you know, it's a really spectacular kind of show that the Tibetan government, you know, puts on. And so here you're really like this, you know, flying lion, you know, with 8 feet and all of these other things. So it's kind of just using their own resources to work against themselves in a way that allows for sarcasm, it allows for distance, it allows for social comment, and so on. So it takes a while to kind of figure that out. As I said, I wouldn't have figured it out. You know, I would have said, as this is our, you know, our field, you know, Tibetans, they have like many, you know, exotic ideas. This is one of their exotic ideas, that the Dalai Lama is really a Garuda. Oh yeah, okay, I can take that. You know, he was being sarcastic. So that's the part that you have to really kind of use your literary kind of intelligence.
Can I add something to that?
Yes,
Yes.
I'm not sure that the audience can hear you.
Oh, yes. Should I turn around?
I don't know.
Yeah, the camera is,
Oh, there's a camera
there's a
right
mic
there.
there, but there's a camera over there, so
Oh,
you
yes.
turning around is good.
This is Christopher Beckwith speaking.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I studied with Professor Norbu. You mentioned that Tibetology Norbu was the Dalai Lama's eldest brother. Anyway, but I studied with him in several different topics. And one of the things that I got from him was he had a very, to me, hilarious sense of humor. And it was absurd. He liked to tell these absurd, the jokes all had an absurd ending. And the first time I heard one, everybody was sitting there with their mouths kind of half open, you know. It was in a class, you know, and nobody got it at all. And then somehow, and he started laughing. And then, you know, somehow that broke the ice, and I got the idea. And so many of these jokes that he ends stories are, you know, very sophisticated, absurd sense of humor to them. So anyway, it's something I like. It sounds like that's what's going on with this.
All over the place, yeah.
Yes.
Michael?
So I'm curious, where does translation fit into this? What you're describing?
It fits in an absolutely major way.
Yeah,
I mean, I told you the story of my trying this beautiful, beautiful text. And I still have it in my mind myself that I like to get it literally really right and then start to play with it.
right.
And I do think, I still regret in that publication that I came out with, that I didn't quite really make it as much as literature as I might have. You know, there's obviously very difficult questions about literature. How many liberties can you take?
Right.
And in
Right, how
the-
true are you to the
target-
original,
in-
blah, blah,
in
blah.
the target
Yeah.
languages versus the original, I was
Right.
trying to have it both ways. It's a very hard thing to do, but I certainly do know that watching other people read the text, this is the way that I understood that text the best, is by watching how others read it, made me understand it. And the more you understand it, I feel that the more you can translate better, for sure. That it's only one part of it. You need to be a poet or a literary writer in your own right as well. But yeah, it's a big problem, you know.
Thanks.
Can we take another one online if there is one? Oh, okay, then in person.
There's a, really?
Go ahead, Dr. Childs.
Hi, Janet. Thank you. I love this talk because you were preaching to the choir, if I'm a choir of one. Anthropology has been grappling with this for a long time, and there's a lot of movements that have been going on now for about 30 years in collaborative ethnography, participatory research. And the Wenner-Gren Foundation now even funds what they call engaged research grant, where you have to demonstrate that your research questions are coming through your interlocutors rather from the position of academia. So I'm just wondering, in moving forward, how would you envision advocating some of these ideas across Tibetan studies? And can you envision some sort of a panel to discuss this? You know, because we're coming at very similar issues like attribution of the co-production of knowledge, but from very different disciplinary perspectives. So do you have any thoughts on kind of how do you bring the disciplines together on this?
Okay, you asked a bunch of different questions there. In terms of disciplines, you know, obviously anthropology is different than textual study. But, you know, at least in my own experience, and I think pretty much in the field of Tibetan studies up to the present, by and large, pretty much nobody does their work in a vacuum without working very closely with Tibetans. It's not anthropology, but it's working with people from the region, from that what I was talking about. So in many ways, we're facing similar issues. So I very much like what you say. I guess the only thing that I want to make a distinction, and I'm trying to do both of these things, is one of them has to do with the place of ethnic indigenous Tibetans within the academy and lifting up our fellow scholars, especially in the PRC, but also in the community in exile. And I personally hope to see a much greater participation of Tibetans as professors, as academics in international academia. That's a little bit different than your quote unquote informants or interlocutors who are not necessarily academics. They may know things that are interesting to you, but that's different than having an academic colleague. You know, and then the question of authorship is really a tricky one, and I have felt it a little bit myself. So, for example, when I wrote that book on Jigme Lingpa, which, as I said, so in the book that I published, it contained a translation of the whole work. It also contained my analysis, which was comparing it to Western literary theory, you know, and analyzing it from very, you know, the book was my book. I wrote it. But I was very, very much indebted to Kemba Belden Sharif and a few other Tuba Tundrup and a few other Tibetans who I read this material. Did it make sense for them to be co-authors? I didn't think so. I still don't think they were actually co-authors, but I mentioned them in, in prominent way in the intro. That's a complicated question. My work with Kemal Bloom, now we published 2 articles already, and he kept telling me that, he was reading with me, but I should be the author. I said, no way. So it actually turned out that when we published at least the 2 articles so far, I basically wrote them, but all the ideas, all the stuff, all the material that we came from, really putting the whole vision of the thing. It wasn't just me reading the text with him. So I insisted there's no way that you're not going to be a co-author. And I also insisted that his name should come first. And that makes sense to me. So it kind of depends who it is that you're working with, whether you're a co-author or not. But I think there's a lot of spaces along a spectrum of possibility. But I think we need to lean in the direction of lifting up and helping our colleagues in Tibetan context. I really, really think it's very important that the field should not be monopolized by non-Tibetan scholars, if possible, if our world continues for the next year or so, if we don't totally blow the planet up.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience here? What about online, Ben?
I think we're all good online.
Okay, well, thank you so very much. It's been a great one.